Welcome to the N1 Fitness Podcast. I'm your host as always, Marcus Sadu, and today we've got Scott Young on the show. Scott wrote a book called Ultra Learning, and we all know what we want to learn, but we haven't necessarily been exposed to how to learn in the most effective way possible. So I wanted to have Scott on the podcast to tell us how to learn faster and more effectively, essentially. So what we're going to be covering is, first of all, why learning is important, how to reframe your prior associations with learning. So a lot of folks, me included, have some pretty negative associations around learning and school from prior experience and stuff like that. Also, we're going to dig into leveraging what you've learned in the past to your advantage in the present, so not needing to necessarily reinvent the wheel when you want to learn something new. And then the most important learning principle in Scott's eyes is directness or transfer. We'll delve into that, as well as whether going all in is always the best route to take. Also, is it better to batch or space out your learning period? So do large chunks less frequently, or to do smaller chunks more frequently. We get into the best and worst language learning apps. We use language a lot as an example throughout this episode just because it's a pretty classic example and it's something that I'm actually really just interested in personally. Also, we delve into how to avoid procrastination around learning. So without further ado, let's dig into this episode. I hope you enjoy it. Scott Young, welcome to the show, my man. Thanks so much for taking the time to be with us.
Oh, yeah. So great to be here.
Now, for the folks who may not be familiar with your work yet, how did you get into the learning how to learn space to begin with?
Yeah, so it's kind of funny. I think I started because I was a student. And as a student, learning is sort of your job. And I got really interested in the question of, how do you learn the things that you need to do in your university degree in a way that's effective and efficient so that you can, not have to spend all your time studying. And so that kind of got me started with it. But the topic of ultra learning, this sort of self-directed kind of crazy projects, that kind of came about when I was on exchange. So I got a chance to go for an exchange for a year to France. And when I went there, I was very interested in learning French. I thought, it'd be so cool to come back and I could speak this other language and parler en français and stuff like that. And I went and I talked to other students who had been on exchange and I asked them, I'm thinking of doing this. Did you learn the language when you went on this country? And the really crazy thing is no one does that. No one learns the language when they go to these countries. And this was very puzzling for me because, I think a lot of people who maybe haven't lived abroad or haven't tried to learn another language, it's very easy to say, oh, well, if you just go live in that country for a little bit, you'll come back speaking the language. That's a common opinion I've heard. And actually, especially if we're talking about like the period of length of an exchange, which is, a semester or 2 semesters, the only people who came back speaking the language were people who'd already been studying it for a few years before they went to that country. And it wasn't until I went on exchange that I understood why they said that. And the reason is that you go on exchange and often your classes are in English. You meet other exchange students. They speak to you in English. People from the country, they speak to you in English. And eventually you just sort of stay stuck there and you have a very hard time practicing sufficiently to really improve your ability in this language. And so I was in France and I had this whole idea that I was going to come back speaking French and I was struggling with it. And I was introduced to this guy who kind of forever changed my life, this guy named Benny Lewis. And Benny Lewis is sort of somewhat famous now, but he was just starting his blog back then. And he has a blog called Fluent in 3 Months. And I mean, when you are struggling with something, when you're having difficulty learning something, you're really struggling. And then you see some guy's website that says Fluent in 3 months. The first feeling you have is, oh, that's bullshit. Like, there's no way that you can learn a language that quickly. But I was very curious because I've been in France for more than 3 months now and my French is crap. And so I'm wondering, what is he doing differently? How is he approaching it differently? And I got a chance to meet him and he kind of shifted my whole perspective because, like I was saying, my sort of interest in learning have mostly been in how do you do well in school. And I realized that he had a completely different philosophy towards learning skills, especially, difficult skills like learning languages. And his approach was he would just dive in and he would be sort of, even though he hadn't practiced very much, he maybe just had a phrase book, learned a few sentences, he is starting to speak to people right away and he's getting much closer to full immersion and all of these things. And so he was acquiring this language, and I felt like I was a fairly smart guy, but he was learning languages much faster and more efficiently than I was. And so this kind of got the gears turning in my head of maybe a lot of the ways that we've been taught to learn skills, language or stuff in school, or even just, any skill that you want to get good at, a lot of the ways that we've been taught to learn maybe aren't the most effective ways. And maybe there's more effective ways to learn things. And so this kind of put me down the path of learning on my own projects and really getting interested, not just in learning from the case of like, wow, how do you pass an exam or how do you get the grades, but how do you get really good at things that matter in your life?
That's really cool, man. Now, personally, I love to learn. It's one of my favorite things to do, but that hasn't always been the case. So for the folks who might not necessarily see the potential value in learning right now, why should they care about it in the first place?
Yeah, so I think this is something really important because when I talk about learning, I think a lot of people think about their experience in school and they think, did I like that? Or maybe they were good in school and then they realize, you know what, I don't actually use a lot of that stuff I learned in school. What a stupid waste of time that was. Or maybe they struggled in school. And so when they think of learning and I talk about learning, it's like, oh God, I have to get away from that. Like I don't want to do that at all. But when you talk to these people, and this is, maybe I'm talking to you right now when you're listening to this, there's inevitably something that you're good at, something that you think is important to you. And maybe you don't classify it as learning, but it's something that's very important to you. So maybe it's, I want to get good at this sport. Or maybe it's, I want to really get in shape or improve my nutrition. Or maybe it's, I want to manage my money better or improve in my career or start a business or all these things. And the truth is that all of these skills, all these areas of your life, you get better at them by learning. You get better at them by being able to do things that you couldn't before, by knowing things that you didn't before. And so it's this kind of learning, the real practical learning skills and being good at things that you actually care about, that is really sort of the thing that, I'm passionate about. Yes, academics, doing well in school, those things do matter, but they're just such a small, narrow slice of what I'm talking about when I talk about learning. And so when people tell me that they're not interested in learning, I think they just have the wrong idea of what learning is all about.
Yeah, man, I totally agree. And I was one of those people that had a fairly negative association with school. I just didn't really enjoy it all that much. And the only reason I showed up was pretty much because there were girls there and I wanted to play sports. So how would you recommend that someone start potentially reframing the concept of learning if it doesn't necessarily leave them with a great feeling because of those prior associations?
Well, so I think, again, it's a broadening of your view of what it means to learn things. So, I'll tell this story. So I have this friend, and he has been he's been in sort of entrepreneurial circles for a long time, and he has started a new company, and he's been trying to learn programming. He's been trying to get coding a little bit because he's a non-technical co-founder of this startup, and he wanted to be able to understand what they're talking about and participate, and he's been starting coding. And I remember when I first told him about this book that I'm writing, this ultra learning book, and he was kind of like, well, I don't know how interested I am about learning or this topic. And then he started reading it, and then we started talking about the conversation. He's like, oh my God, this book is like for me. This is written for me in my life. And so I think what I want to reframe is that for a lot of us, it's just a vocabulary thing that, yeah, we don't think about, I don't really care about learning, because when I say learning, I'm thinking about memorizing history trivia or passing your math class. But I care about getting good at things, or I care about improving my life, or I care about understanding myself better or other people, or, having better relationships, having, being able to communicate better, being able to do all these things. And the way that you get better at those skills is learning, although it's often not the kind of learning that you do in school, which is, what my book is often about, is talking about how it's very different to acquire these skills. And some of the ways that we think about learning in school, it's actually not very effective. And that's often why we have bad experiences with it.
I'm glad that you mentioned the verbalizing thing, or the language that we use, because I feel like I have caught myself a bunch of times, and I've heard so many people say this, like, I'm bad with names, or I'm just not good with languages. You mentioned languages before. Mm-hmm. So how would you recommend that folks kind of start to catch themselves with their language, and how important is that sort of stuff when it comes to learning new stuff?
Well, I think the language is expressing a belief, and the belief comes from a feeling. And the feeling is when I talk about some subject. Now, I don't know what it is for you when you're listening at home or in your commute when you're listening to this, but there's some subject for you that when I say it, it's going to make you go, like you have a bad feeling about it. Now, maybe that's math, maybe that's art, maybe that's dancing, maybe that's, learning social skills or communicating. It could be anything. And all of us have those things. All of us have those little, black weaknesses, those spots in our back of our mind where we're like, oh God, we don't want to go there. We don't want to explore that. And my point here is not to say that you need to work on all the things that you're bad at and fix all your weaknesses, but rather to recognize that when we're talking about learning, and when we're talking about getting better at things, that these emotions drive a lot of our behavior. And so we say to ourselves, oh, that's not important, or I'm not going to do it. But maybe what it is, you know what, I had a bad experience with this, or I tried to do this and I failed. And so it develops this kind of, psychological loop where you start to feel bad. And so you avoid it. And because you're bad and you avoid it, you stop doing it. And so what I want to kind of encourage people to do is not to sort of tell yourself, not to look in the mirror and say, I'm great and I'm worth it, or any of those kind of cheesy affirmations. I'm not trying to explain people to do that. Rather, I want actually people to doubt themselves more. I want people to, have more uncertainty about the things they can and can't do. Because very often we get into these loops where you feel like you had a bad experience, and because you had a bad experience, you avoid anything that's related to that topic. And I think it's just the idea is that you don't know what the best way to do things is. And I think that curiosity of, what might you be able to accomplish? What things might you be able to do? Not just the things that you're bad at right now, but even the things that you're good at. What are the things that, bring you a lot of joy? What if you looked in the process of getting better and maybe there's some of those things that you could improve in that as well, to go from being all right at something to being truly great? And so I think that curiosity and really looking at what's the process of getting better at things itself, I think, that starts to open your mind up to, oh, maybe I could learn this, or maybe I could get better at this, or maybe this thing that scared me or made me feel bad in the past could actually be something that, brings me joy or excitement in my life.
I love that distinction, man. And I think that stems off into your thoughts around isolating what's worked in the past and using it to your advantage today. So basically not needing to reinvent the wheel when it comes to having success with something new. So can you expand on that for us?
Right. So I think one of the things that we often do is, again, like I said, oh, I'm not good at learning X. And people have this sort of, I've had conversations with people where they'll say something that they've been good at, that they've also said something, maybe that they haven't been good at. And what's interesting is that often they're not really fully aware of what are the principles that underlie the things that they were good at, or where they didn't apply those principles, the things that they weren't as good at. And if you can sort of bring their attention to these things, and they're often subtle things, they're often things that are not obvious when you're doing stuff that, like, oh, this is very important that it's done in this way in order for you to be successful getting better at this thing. That if you can bring your attention to the principles, I've had this as my book is sort of centered around 9 different principles for learning more effectively and for doing this kind of ultra learning. That what I find is that when you cue people into these principles, they often say to themselves, like, oh, this is why that thing that I got really good at, that hobby or that sport or that activity that I got really good at, I got really good at it because I was sort of applying these principles. But then you also cue into yourself, oh, maybe this is why my, attempt to learn French didn't work, or my attempt to do this failed miserably, because I wasn't applying this approach. I was using some other approach, and it didn't really work with how, your brain is sort of set up to learn things or get good at things.
Now, we probably won't have time to dig into all 9 principles, but can we go through a few of them that we can sort of get people started with?
So I want to talk about the most important one, and this is one that has come up again and again. And it's funny because there is actually over 100 years of psychological literature essentially showing that the way we typically think about school and learning in school has some serious deficits. And so this principle I call directness, but it's based on a robust set of scientific literature about transfer. So transfer is when you learn something in one context, say in a classroom, and then you want to apply it to a different context, let's say in real life. And what we've known for decades now is that people are actually surprisingly bad at this. So one of my favorite studies is one study took economics majors and they asked them questions of economic reasoning and found that going to school and studying economics did not make them do better than people who had not studied economics. In another study, it was found that taking a high school psychology class did not improve your ability in a college level psychology class, which, is kind of confusing. Why would studying a bit of something not help with studying it later? In another study, they found that honors level physics students, so people who have gotten the best grades in a physics class, were often unable to solve physics problems that differed even just superficially from the kinds that they encountered in school. And so it seems that, to quote one researcher, that what we learn is welded in place and subject matter to the context we learn it. And so the idea of directness is to flip this on its head, is that if transfer is difficult, especially when we start learning things, then we need to apply the skills that we want to learn directly. And so if you are learning some new skill, the first question to ask yourself is, how do I want to use it? Or if I'm learning some sort of knowledge or theoretical knowledge, one of the questions to ask yourself is, where will I apply this? And if you start to ask yourself this question, then you can start to engineer practice environments that are either the same as the place that you want to use the skill in, or are similar enough that transfer won't be a huge issue. So with the language learning example, one of the major reasons I struggled with learning French in the beginning is that I simply wasn't having enough conversations in French. I was studying at home, doing little exercises in the book, but I wasn't having enough actual practice. Whereas Benny Lewis, sort of my first mentor to this world of kind of extreme self-education, he was diving into huge volumes of practice from the very first day, and it's how he got good at languages really quickly. And I talk about a number of other examples in the book where people got really good at hard skills in short periods of time, and the way that they typically did it is by applying a lot of direct practice, where the typical path to learning that skill would mean, maybe you're getting a little bit of direct practice here and there, whereas these people were having huge concentrations of it up front.
I feel like the language example is such a good one. I had that same experience when I was originally trying to learn Spanish. I was using Duolingo, and
yeah.
It just, it's so different having a conversation, actually. And once I started doing consistent lessons and just doing a whole bunch of conversation, going back and forth, having to think on the fly, my learning with that subject, or with Spanish specifically, accelerated so much faster.
Oh my God. It's so funny you mentioned that, because I actually, in that chapter where I talk about directness, I talk about Duolingo of all things. So there's a weird synchronicity there. And the reason I talk about it is that I've spoken to people, and I'm not talking about just people who are, unintelligent or uneducated. These are smart people who are trying to learn another language, and they're trying to do it earnestly. Like, they've been using Duolingo for 6 months or 9 months. And then they go to one of these countries, or they have an opportunity to practice it, and they can't speak it. And what they draw from that is often the wrong lesson. So sometimes what these people draw is, I must just not be good at learning languages. Or they say, well, I've been doing it for 6 months, but I just haven't been trying hard enough. I just have to put in more effort. And the thing that I've realized is that very often, if you have the right approach, you can do much better than the status quo, because these sort of subtle learning principles and transfer, this thing that we're talking about, is very clearly one of those. Because what you actually do in a Duolingo exercise is, sort of mentally speaking, not very similar to the actual act of speaking a language. So if I had to speak in this conversation right now to you in Spanish, I would have to be thinking of ideas, or possibly in the beginning whole sentences in English that I need to translate into Spanish. Now, how do I do that? Well, I have to think about what all the words are for the sentence. I have to put them in the right order. I have to make sure I pronounce them correctly. With a language like Spanish, I also have to be careful about conjugation, because conjugation and all these grammatical features are also very important in order to be understood correctly. Now, if I'm doing a Duolingo exercise, what do I have to do? Well, I get that same English sentence that I maybe want to translate. And what does it give me? It gives me a word bank with about 15 words below, and I have to tap them with my finger to make the sentence in Spanish. Now, as I said, the differences between these two approaches are vast. When I'm actually speaking, I don't have the word bank, so I don't know what the words are. Maybe it's the case that I've never learned the word I have to say, so I have to find some sort of detour to try to express the same thought, but not quite as directly as in English or as articulately. I, don't know what the conjugation is. I have to form the sounds with my mouth as opposed to tapping them with my finger. So these differences can accumulate. So you can spend 6 months on Duolingo and find that maybe you've only really practiced maybe 20% or 30% of the underlying sub-skills that are necessary for practicing this language. So you go on a trip to Cancun and you find that you can't say anything beyond some of the simple basics, even though you've studied a lot, because there's this problem of transfer. And so this is, again, one of these subtle psychological principles that if once you understand it, you start to see it in learning everything. And it manifests in really subtle ways. And so once you can spot it, you can start to notice, oh, this is what I would need to do if I wanted to get better at this, and you can adjust your approach.
I love that, man. Really, really good stuff. Now, I was lucky in the sense that when it came to Spanish, I moved to Mexico for 5 months and I was able to take advantage of the immersion aspect. So how important is that? And if folks don't have an option to completely immerse themselves in, whatever it may be, it doesn't have to be a language, it could be something else that they're trying to learn, how can they use that to their advantage?
Well, so I think the important thing here is that there's two sort of perspectives that I want to contrast. So one perspective is sort of, again, like I started my opening conversation, that there's a lot of people who think, oh, well, you went to Mexico, and so obviously you speak Spanish, obviously. And I think this is a really big misnomer, because sometimes people go to these countries and they just think that they'll just learn the language automatically. And that is not true. That is 100% not true. I have found that if you live in a European country, because the languages tend to be a little bit easier, for long enough, so people who've lived in France for like 5 or 6 years, or Spain for 5 or 6 years, tend to learn the language all right. It's not guaranteed, but it's usually just because after 2 or 3 years, they're like, okay, let's put in some work and try to learn this. However, when I've been to Asian countries, so if you go to China or to Korea, I've met people who've lived in these countries for 20 plus years and they can't even say simple things in the language. So it's certainly not the case that just going to the country is the solution to learn a language. On the other perspective, though, is you have people who say, well, I can't go to this country. I can't go and do full immersion. So how the heck can I learn this language? And so this is sort of often these people who, again, they drift towards something like Duolingo because, well, what else are you going to do, right? How are you going to practice Spanish? How are you going to learn this? And the truth is that there are tons of ways that you can learn and practice in ways that are effective at home. One of my favorite services is called italki.com. And basically, if you want, you can pay a bit of money and set yourself up with a tutor who will be able to have, a dialogue with you, and you can start that early practice just as you would do if you were traveling in that country. Or if you don't have the money, or you want to, save a little bit of cash, you can also find language partners, which are free. So you just set them up, and then you just have to spend a little bit of time practicing with them in English, and they'll help you with the language you're trying to learn. But the important thing, that's more important than what tool you use, is just recognizing that this is what you have to do if you want to get good at learning languages. And that the more the way you're practicing doesn't resemble the way you need to use it, the more you're going to have these transfer problems. And this can actually manifest itself in pretty subtle ways. So I want to tell a little example, if you'll let me go on another little detour right here.
Please.
So I was learning salsa dancing. And so salsa dancing is nothing like learning a language. Well, I mean, like a little bit. But I want to just point out how thinking about these kind of principles, in this case, this principle directness, is so valuable. So I was in the class, and the way the class would work is we would learn some piece of choreography. So you'd learn, you're going to do a spin, and then you're going to do a thing on the back, and you're going to go and do this step, and then step side to side, and then you're done. And it would be a little sequence that would take about maybe 30 seconds and have 7 or 8 little parts to it. And you would practice it, and you would, rotate. So you would do it with one person, you do it with another person, and you would learn, several pieces of this choreography like this. And then I went to one of these social dancing situations where it's not in the class, it's just people who've come together to salsa dance. And suddenly, it was extremely difficult. I was doing all right in the class, but it was very difficult to do these dance moves. And the reason why is because one of the very important skills of dancing when you're actually doing it in real life is that the other person doesn't know the choreography. So you have to communicate to them with your body language what you want the person to do. Or if you're a follow, you have to be able to listen to what the lead wants you to do in this sort of dance choreography. Whereas when you're in the class, because the partners know what you're trying to do and you know what you're trying to do, you don't actually have to work on that skill. And so these issues of transfer, these issues of directness can actually be quite subtle. And so sometimes you can get in a situation where you spend a lot of time learning and you think, well, I'm doing it. I am dancing. Why am I finding it so hard in this situation? And it's because of these little issues of transfer. So again, directness and transfer is just one principle, but I think it's something that once you fully appreciate it, you just see it as this lens in all these things that you're trying to get good at, and you can start to note, oh, I'm trying to get good at this, but I'm missing this key ingredient, and that's what's holding me back when I'm trying to actually use the skill in real life.
Yeah, that's a really sneaky nuance that you wouldn't have picked up on unless you had actually gone to that different sort of setup with your salsa dancing class. I like that.
Yes, and I think it's something to be paying attention to as well, because again, I think for a lot of people, they learn something in a classroom or from a book, or they, read some business book or this kind of thing, and they're like, why isn't this making a connection to my life? Why isn't this, why is this so difficult to apply this skill? And it's just sort of recognizing some of this mismatch. And it's not to say that going to the class is bad or reading the book is bad, or even using some, flashcards or something like that is bad for learning a language. But just to recognize, what you need to do. And one of these things is make sure that you're doing some practice in a situation that is as close as possible to where you want to use it. And then this will be sort of your kind of testing ground for what little pieces of the skill are you missing, what little bits of knowledge do you not have in order to do this successfully.
Now, when it comes to practicing, putting this stuff into practice, I would imagine that it depends on, how fast somebody wants to learn something and what that specific thing is. But do you have any general principles around, are you more of a fan of people spending a concentrated block once per week or dispersing that same amount of time throughout, the 5 to 7 days? Or how do you like people to approach that in the most effective way possible?
So there's some interesting research on this. One of the most robust principles of learning as it applies to memory is known as the spacing effect. So the spacing effect basically says that if you, let's say, study something and you study it 10 times in a row, or you study it once a day for 10 days, that latter person who studied it once a day for 10 days is going to remember it better and longer for the same amount of input time. So there is a sense that from a memory standpoint, you're better off with distributed practice, meaning practicing a little bit every day rather than in a concentrated chunk. Now, I'll caution that, and I'll flip that around a little bit as well, because there is a flip side of that. And one of the flip sides is that learning is hard, and it's often frustrating. And it's often something that, if you're going to, let's say we're using our Spanish example, if you want to start speaking Spanish, I'm not an idiot. I know that what I'm suggesting is difficult, that setting up that tutoring session and having a conversation and really trying to speak in Spanish and not just talk about Spanish in English is hard to do, and it's difficult. And so I do think that there is some benefit of having a focused amount of time. Doesn't mean that you're doing it full time in your daily schedule, but rather that you are dedicating yourself or prioritizing yourself to a particular learning project over, let's say, a couple months or a month or two. That's more valuable than, let's say, I'm going to try to learn 20 things at the same time over 3 years. And the reason why is just because when you try to juggle too many things, I think it can often be the case that you drift towards doing whatever is easiest, whatever is the most fun, whatever is. And this sort of drift to whatever is easiest can often, subtly shift you towards doing, let's say, Duolingo rather than the conversation practice, which is really much more effective in terms of the amount of time input. So I would say that there's these two effects. And so for the people listening to this right now, if you only have half an hour a day to learn something new, that's plenty. But what I'd also add to that is that it's probably better to pick a specific, concrete, very sort of bite-sized chunk thing that you want to learn and focus on that one at a time rather than doing 50 different things, at least in the beginning, just because you want to make sure that, you're really learning that one thing you're doing as opposed to just doing a bunch of kind of, I'll call them sort of edutainment, kind of like education entertainment, where you're just doing something that's fun but isn't really acquiring real skills. that's related to that activity, which I think a lot of us know what we're talking about when we're saying using fun apps or, watching some YouTube video rather than, okay, but actually let's get good at this.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Now, building off of our language example, are there apps that you like more so and other apps that you aren't as big of a fan of?
Yes. So we've already talked about what I like the best, which is direct practice. And I think that direct practice with language learning is essential at all stages of learning a language. So many people get in their idea, well, of course, but I can't start speaking right away. And this is usually not true. Now, I mean, it is difficult to speak right away, but if you wanted to have a conversation in a language that you know literally zero about, you could have a conversation with someone where you type everything you say into Google Translate and you read it out, and then they say whatever they say, and then they type it to you and you copy it and put it in Google Translate and you say it out. And that sounds really awkward, but I have had very early conversations using exactly this method, and it does help you bootstrap a bit. Now, it's not enough, but it's a good starting placeholder activity, even when you have zero knowledge. So I highly recommend, if you're thinking about learning a language, to do something like that right away. Just because it's very easy to get in the idea of, well, I'm not ready yet, and well, I'm not ready yet turns into 3 months, 6 months, 3 years, and then you just really are wasting a lot of time. So it is true that it's useful to have some vocabulary, some basic knowledge of phrases, some basic patterns memorized before you start really practicing, but I would do that placeholder activity right off the bat. In terms of apps, in terms of things that are not direct practice that I recommend, I think the best tool that I found for giving you the kind of absolute basics to kind of bootstrap those conversations to be able to have the basics ones, I like doing 1 month of Pimsleur. Now, Pimsleur is a paid program, so it is something that, it's not like Duolingo. It's not completely free. But I like Pimsleur more than Duolingo for two reasons. One is that if you actually do what the program tells you to do, you actually speak out loud the phrases that you have to produce. And then you also have to recall them from memory rather than just selecting them, recognizing them from a word bank. And those two differences are not minor. They're very big differences that I think make Pimsleur a somewhat better approach. Pimsleur also focuses on phrases, which I think is a more useful starting point than individual words, because one of the difficulties when you start speaking a language is assembling a sentence out of all the individual words you've learned, and that can be quite taxing. Whereas if you know whole phrases that you can say, like, where is the blank? How is that blank? When is this? I would like to blank. If you have those phrasal patterns memorized, it's a lot easier to insert vocabulary, and Pimsleur is good for that. I wouldn't recommend doing more than 1 month of Pimsleur. I think once you've done more than 1 month, now you're just kind of procrastinating on the direct practice approach. I do think when you've already done some direct practice, so once you've actually, had some of those very halting Google Translate conversations and you've maybe done a month of Pimsleur, then I would recommend you can probably do a little bit of maybe textbook exercises, a little bit of vocabulary practice, maybe some flashcards. If we're talking about a language like Spanish, where grammar is an important thing, you might do some grammar exercises to work on, like your conjugation and things like this. And so I think those sorts of exercises can be helpful, but they're built on the foundation of actually having little back and forth conversations with people. They're not a substitute for it. So I think as long as people keep that perspective in mind, that they won't go astray.
Yeah, that's a great breakdown, man. Now, procrastination is a biggie, especially when it comes to learning something new that you want to learn, but you don't necessarily need to learn. So how do you recommend folks handle procrastination, or just the urge to procrastinate, so they can start moving towards their goals more effectively?
Right. So one of the things that I already talked about, which I think is super important, is picking a single, very concrete, chunked down goal that you will focus on for a fixed period of time. Like you're going to focus on it for 1 month or 2 months. And the reason I think this is important is because, again, the starting process of learning a lot of things is often difficult. If you're like, okay, I'm going to learn about investing, and you're like, oh God, I have to read all these books that use a bunch of math, and or I'm going to learn about programming, and then you're like, how the heck do I even get it set up on my computer? And every time I type something, it gives an error. Or like we were talking about with languages, there's lots of skills that there's that frustration barrier in the beginning. And so I recommend having a single sort of concrete chunked project. And I think that that's useful because, okay, this is a focusing point of your attention. The reason a lot of people don't make progress learning things is because they don't have that. They just have sort of a diffuse, vague desire, like, I should really learn to play the guitar sometime. Well, okay, that's never going to amount to anything. But if you say to yourself, okay, here's a simple guitar song, I'd like to learn to play that over the next, 3 weeks. Okay, now we're actually making some progress. Or if we're talking about learning a language, I'd like to learn 25 common phrases in Spanish for my upcoming trip to Mexico. Or, I would like to learn enough programming that I can, write an Excel macro, or whatever it is. You just chunk it down to a very small starting point, and you make it very concrete, and you focus on it. That would be one thing. The second thing that I think is important when we're talking about procrastination is just recognizing that we are emotional creatures, that, we were talking about this before, but when I talk about learning, it sort of automatically evokes some kind of emotional response. And maybe for you, that emotional response is not a positive one. Maybe when I talk about math, or I talk about French, or I talk about drawing, you just have these kind of traumatic memories that bubble up from your psyche. And it's very hard to start learning something when you have this kind of pit of feeling in your stomach where it's just all tied up in knots and you can't imagine doing it. And so the thing to think about in those situations, and maybe your feeling isn't traumatic, but it's just, this is a little frustrating or a little hard, is to recognize that feeling and to recognize that, this feeling might make it a little harder to work on this. So I'm going to put aside a little bit of time, set aside some time in my calendar, set aside some time in my day to focus on doing this, and not just expect myself to just spontaneously start practicing the guitar, start spontaneously learning how websites are put together, or how, investing works, or whatever it is that you want to learn how to do.
So you'd recommend that people get really specific around, like you mentioned, the 25 words, or blocking out the time in their day and really prioritizing it and getting, quite tangible with this stuff, as opposed to just sort of saying oh, I'd like to learn this. No, let's dial in one song and let's put a time frame on it, and then we can take the steps necessary in order to achieve that given goal and then move on to the next.
I think there's nothing wrong with having big ambitions about things you want to learn. Like, you might say, maybe the thing that you're excited about is being fluent in French, or it is about, just whipping out the guitar and, playing songs that your friends call out to you at the party, or maybe it is, I want to actually be a professional programmer. I don't want to just write an Excel macro. I want my job to be, working in a tech company where I'm earning a 6-figure salary. These are okay ambitions. I think even if you have those ambitions, it's useful to start with very small concrete projects, both from a motivational standpoint and also from this principle of directness that we were talking about before, that this is tying you to a specific context where you have some specific result. And if your goal is to just, well, I just want to learn French, and because I want to learn French, I got to learn all the words anyways, so let me just memorize a huge list of vocabulary. It's no, don't do that. Maybe you can memorize a list of vocabulary when you're already having conversations and you're already well ahead, but don't start there. And so I think concrete, specific, direct, these kinds of, adjectives to describe your project when you start are very helpful, because they frame what you're doing in terms of something achievable that's a good starting point. And then from there, you can really go as far as you want. You can go to just doing a very small concrete thing that you need to do in your life to get past it, and then you're done. Or you can dive in and master something and learn new hobbies and skills, or heck, even a new profession.
Yeah, man, that's really important stuff. And that actually these ideas translate into pretty much every area of life, like nutrition wise too. I mean, some folks will come to me and they'll talk about starting their fat loss phase off with a cleanse or a detox diet or something like that. But that's really not a sustainable or useful approach for them long term. And so I sort of try and push them in the direction of okay, what can we stick to? What's going to be really useful in your day-to-day life from a lifestyle standpoint? And let's just implement that from the beginning, as opposed to trying something fancy that is, a short-term solution. Let's work with something that's going to be a long-term, more so permanent thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is something that really appeals to me, is that if we're talking about nutrition especially, I mean, we all have some general idea of what it means to eat healthy. I mean, there are some debates about different things, but we all kind of understand that, having broccoli is probably better than having that milkshake. And so there is a sense that when we're talking about a topic like nutrition, that, well, learning's not important. It's just about doing things. I just have to be good at doing things. But really, when you start to see your own habits, your own behavior, your own sort of way that you integrate nutrition and healthy eating and exercise into your life, now all of a sudden it's kind of a complicated topic. There's all sorts of things like, habits, there's cravings, there's all sorts of little nuances that are not only theoretical knowledge applies to that. So, there's things like macronutrients and these kind of things, but also practical knowledge of how do I schedule my life so that I'm not constantly succumbing to temptations to go off of my set plan. And so I think when you approach things this way, you see that, really most of the goals that we have in life are some kind of learning goal. They're just maybe not the kind of learning goals we're used to from school.
So Scott, before we get into where folks can find out more about you and your work, is there anything that we didn't get to today that you'd like to mention, or is there something that you'd just like to leave the listeners with?
So if you're interested in this topic, if you found these ideas interesting and helpful, I'd highly recommend checking out the book, because there's a whole 8 other principles that we discuss. And I think, again, even if you don't see yourself as being really interested in learning, I think that this book will help you with a lot of the goals and things that you're trying to achieve in your life.
Awesome, man. Now, where is the best place for folks to find the book Ultra Learning, your podcast, as well as your social handles and all that good stuff?
So I would recommend going to my website, which is scotthyung.com. That's SCOTTHYOUNG.com. And there I not only have links to the book, which you can get at Amazon, Barnes & Noble. It's also Audible. If you're not tired of listening to me talk right now, you can listen to me read the book. You can go and get the book there. But also I have over 1,300 articles that I've written on my website. So there's many articles on habits, goal setting, self-improvement, understanding yourself, life philosophy, psychology. And so even if you're not sure whether you want to get the book quite yet, there's quite a bit to read, quite a bit to explore.
Awesome, man. I'll link to all that stuff in the show notes. And thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, this was great being here and discussing this with you.
I hope you guys enjoyed that interview with Scott Young. I just wanted to thank all the people that have reviewed the podcast on iTunes. We have 21 5-star reviews now, which is amazing. So I wanted to take a second to thank the people that have taken a minute to review the podcast on iTunes. It really helps us grow and reach more folks with this information. So thank you again, and I will catch you guys on the next episode. See ya.